Oh, magic makers. So I have a great lady here. Her name is Jessica John. And let me just say, this chick has lived a couple of lives. So I'm going to do my best to stay on track because you know me, I get easily distracted. And I apologize. It is warm here in Boston, and I had to open my window because it's so bleeping hot. But of course, now there's like something flying behind me. So I apologize for any noise that might be popping up in the background. Just bear with me. All right, so back to Jessica. Jessica is the owner of Circus Mobility. And now you're like, Kim, I wanted to join the circus when I was like 10 and then I grew out of it. No, that is not why I'm talking to her. Today, I'm talking to her more about the mobility and flexibility that we all need in our lives. And she is just fabulous at it because that's her jam, right? Really working with people who having the mobility, the flexibility, I'm even going to say agility in their life is their livelihood. But she also did a stint in the CIA. I'm going to do my best not to talk about that because that is really interesting. But I'm going to stay on task. I'm going to stay on point. So welcome to the show, Miss Jessica.
Thank you. I just have to say that I think we stole your weather here in Oregon because I woke up and it was white.
Oh,
what?
Oh, you're like, dude, like, no, we're good.
Oregon, Oregon's drunk.
Yeah, I know. What's so funny because when it comes to weather, when it's nice out, I'm like, I don't want to talk about it, right? Because I'm like, I don't want to scare it. I don't want it to go away.
Yeah, I moved to Oregon right before the pandemic and really didn't understand the weather. And now 2 years in, I get it. We have like 4 months here in the Valley, Willamette Valley, of bright blue, beautiful weather. And then the rest is just kind of weird. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, we have they say in New England, so I'm probably assuming it's happening to you there. Like if you don't like the weather, just wait an hour.
Yes, exactly. At least where I live in the Valley is like that. If you're in Portland, though, it just stays overcast and nothing ever changes.
I know. And it's my sister-in-law lived in Seattle for years, and I'm just like, every time I went there, I just felt like heavy.
Yeah.
So if you guys live in any of those areas and you're like, oh no, and you can like give us a a TED talk on the weather, bring it on.
I also understand Boston because I lived there for 3 years.
Yeah, I remember you lived here. So yeah, you totally understand our crazy ass weather.
Yes.
So Jessica, we talked about this briefly, but share with my folks, how did you get into this whole, circus, I'm going to call it suspension, aerial type training?
Very, very randomly, like many good things.
Yeah, exactly.
I lived in DC. I was working at the CIA, and I walked past an outdoor flying trapeze rig and thought to myself, whoa, that's cool. I didn't realize that was a thing that people could just do.
Right. Outside of Ringling Brothers, like who does that?
Right. Who knew? And I don't want to do that. Like I had a very immediate reaction, which was very cool. No, that is not for me. But maybe they have something else that is for me. Like there was something that I was drawn to, but I knew that flying trapeze was not it. So I looked up online. It was the Trapeze School of New York, and they had aerial silks classes and static trapeze classes. And I thought, oh, okay, that's at least I know you're going to start low to the ground because I'm at heights.
Oh,
yeah. So I took my first aerial silks class, and I was the type of person that had a personal trainer. I went to the gym 4 days a week. I grew up being a competitive athlete, so I thought I was in good shape.
Yeah.
And then I realized very quickly that I could not do one of the fundamental things with aerial, which is flipping yourself upside down. Like I didn't have the strength to invert my body in the air, which most people don't, but I thought that I had that strength.
Right. Well, because you're like, I've been going to the gym for all these years. Clearly something translates.
Yes. Yes. And it did. I could climb the fabric very well. I climbed all the way to the top, and then I slid down and gave myself a big fabric burn on my feet on the way down. And then I tried to flip upside down, and it was totally impossible. I just didn't have any of that coordination.
Yeah. I have a client who's pole, like this pole dancing, and same thing. You're just like, something has to translate. And she's like, oh no, but like price, she's like 10%.
Right. So I was immediately hooked because I recognized a weakness and I was just intrigued by it in general. So I actually signed up, like I finished the class, signed up for the next one the next day without really thinking about how sore I was going to be, and showed up, did a second class, continued to fail, and then just kept going, like at least twice a week for probably 2 or 3 years. And recognized that the only way I was going to get stronger was not necessarily to just keep showing up to class, but changing the way that I trained. And I hired a new personal trainer who was also an aerialist to help me gain the strength that I was missing, because my previous trainer wasn't sport specific.
All right. So let's go back to 2 things that you said that I'm just like, boom, like if you didn't hear that truth bomb, then were you listening? So first thing, you said, I showed up and continued to fail.
Yes.
How many people would show up for that first class and just be mortified that they didn't crush it, and then be like, sign, that's not for me. See?
Yes. I think, I think that there's a little bit of personality involved. And then there's a little bit of like nurture involved. So growing up as a competitive athlete, you are trained to just, continue to persist.
Yeah.
And whether or not that is a good or bad thing, sometimes it is not a good thing, but it becomes part of your DNA, which is like, I am the type of person that perseveres.
Yeah. And, but I like that. Like, but I also feel like, so many of us, as adults I don't know why we get it into our heads, but we get it into our head that this, I should just show up and boom, like I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Or maybe after, maybe you give it a month and you should be like, Cirque du Soleil level at aerial.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to aerial in particular, and pole dance, I think is the same way,
right?
Where you don't recognize how hard it is until you get into it. It's, if you've been in the gym, you can pick up heavy things. Yes.
Yeah, like you go, because you think, especially if you're like someone like yourself, you're like, I've been going to the gym for decades, right? So like, how hard could this be?
Yeah, and it is much harder, but it is also a lot more motivating, right? Because you recognize that you have this control over your body in a very different way. And again, in the gym, we get into certain movement patterns and certain ranges that, yes, you can lift heavy things, but you don't really have control over your body in, complete range of motion.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull on this thread before I go back. So I like that, because it's like, I feel a lot of my clients, in particular, a lot of the women who listen to this podcast, they go to the gym for control. That, maybe life is like, woo, but I know in the gym, it makes sense for me. I know that I'm going to lift heavy shit. I'm going to put it down, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. And there's order in the chaos.
Yes.
Where, what you just described is that there is still control to some extent, but you have to learn that control. And it's, when you're in aerial, sometimes the control isn't where you think it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's just constant learning.
Yeah.
Right. Once you think you've understood something, you recognize that, oh, wait, I understood it in this small context, and I've just expanded the context, and suddenly I didn't understand it as well as I thought I did.
Right.
And it requires a new level of control,
but
and perhaps new ranges of motion that you didn't need until that moment.
But I also find, correct me if I'm wrong, because I've never been on any of this. I've seen it. Is that it also requires you sometimes to think on the fly.
Yeah, everything doesn't always go according to plan.
Right. So it's like, I know if I go to the gym, I know what a deadlift looks like. I know what, 9 times out of 10, unless I'm trying to max out on something, I'm pretty much going to lift it off the floor and then I'm going to put it back down.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes in some type of move, you think you got it.
Yeah.
And you don't.
Yeah. And it's also interesting kind of culturally. So the gym culture versus circus culture.
Yeah.
Circus culture tends to veer into dance culture sometimes. Yeah. So there's a lot more of this performance, trying to find these more flow states.
Yeah.
Improvisation, that sort of thing. And aerialists, for the most part, are not used to thinking of the work that they do the same way they think of working out in the gym. They don't think of reps. They don't think of weight. They don't think of, volume.
Yeah.
And then they really jack themselves up.
Well, it's so fun. It's so funny because I was like, in my head, I think about, even though I'm not doing 3x10s, I'm thinking about how many times can I flip myself upside down before some part of my body is like, oh no, please stop.
Right. And this isn't thought of. It's just,
I'm trying to
doing the thing until you get it.
Right. And I just think about I remember, I had friends who were competitive gymnasts and just learning a trick. And the thought of doing that same trick 100 times never went through their brain, what they were doing to their bodies in order to land said trick over and over and over again.
Yeah. So I took my classes twice a week, started doing aerial more and more. And guess what?
You got hurt.
I got hurt.
You're right. It also stems back, even on the weight side, when CrossFit took off, years ago, it was in our nature to go to the gym 5, 6, 7 times a week. And because we weren't doing things that required athleticism, you weren't getting hurt. So you're like, why wouldn't I? If this is the gym, right? Why wouldn't I go? And then just like you, people started to increase the volume. They were doing more gymnastic-y, more Olympic lifting type thing. And, shoulders, knees, hips were all like, oh my damn, we're good.
Exactly. I ended up with a really bad shoulder injury, like a lot of aerialists do.
Yeah.
And I remember going to a sport chiropractor, and one of the first things that he said to me, it was, let's look at how you breathe.
Yeah.
It was like, wait, what? I'm doing all this crazy stuff in the air and you're going to bring me back to breath? That just seemed really bizarre to me. But now in retrospect, one of the first things I do with all of my clients is start talking about breath.
Yeah. I'm loving this conversation because as we talk, I have to write things down because you're saying things. I'm like, hang on, I got to go back. I got to circle back, but I'm going to continue to pull on this thread because I agree with you. I had during the pandemic, so maybe a year and a half ago, I was introduced to this woman. Her name is Katie Sinclair, and probably 5 years ago, I had abdominal surgery, and for some reason, I just could not turn on my core. Couldn't do it, no matter how much I focused on trying to do it, how many things I did, I could not like find my core in anything. And then the first thing she did, we breathed. And, of course, I'm a doer. And I was like, what the fuck's this doing? Right. You say that inside your head, you're just
yes.
Like, and meanwhile, I'm smiling.
Oh yeah. I did it. Went to my appointments every week, breathed.
Right. You smile, you're like, yeah, breathing. That I'm paying you for this. Great, awesome. And I gotta tell you, like probably like a month later, I was like, what the hell? I'm like, I can feel my core again after like years of like not having that connection.
Yes. And I will also speak the praises of Katie St. Clair.
Yeah.
But I went through her program recently. And I've started to incorporate a lot more breath work into my own practice because of the work that she shared with me.
Yeah.
And I've had so many aha moments in coaching, recognizing that problems that people have when they're holding their body weight upside down has to do with their breathing patterns. So if they don't know how to expand into the chest, they have a really hard time arching in the thoracic when they're holding their body weight in their hands upside down. It's completely paired together.
Right. And then for those of you listening, some of you might be like, well, first of all, I am never going to be hanging upside down. Okay, great. Fabulous. You're not a bat. But this breath piece, I remember that, before I remember my massage therapist, she would, before we would start, she'd always like, take a deep breath. And I remember the first time I took a deep breath, she laughed out loud because my breath was not deep at all. I think, she's like, Kim, I think you might have gotten to like, if I had an Adam's apple, like you probably got to like my Adam's apple in my throat. And she's like, I want to see your chest rise off of the table. And I couldn't do it. Like that was, and breathing is basic. Like we come out breathing like that. We don't have to learn how to do that, but we dislearn how to take deep breaths.
Yes. And in doing so, we're not creating expansion in certain parts of our body. And what that means is important to everyone, because it means that if you're in the weight room, like your range of motion has to be like bigger or smaller to accomplish the same task as someone else based upon your starting posture. Right.
And so, that whole, and just hearing this all about the breath is also just, the breath also helps like when you're lifting something really heavy. I see a lot of people like, the first instinct when you lift is to hold your breath. Like that's our instinctive, like, I must brace for impact. But it's like, no, I got to use that breath to help, get myself up out of a squat. I use the breath to help me get that barbell off my chest.
Yeah. And also a big problem with aerialists has to do with incontinence because of how people are breathing or holding breath and forcing pressure into the pelvic floor in movements. And they don't talk about it. So nobody knows that it's happening to everyone.
Yeah. So, exactly. Yeah. Well, because, and I've done a whole show on pelvic floor, is because the things they tell us, we're always told to hold. We're always told to hold and clench, and we've held and clenched ourselves so much that like we didn't even know what like loose feels like.
Yes, and imagine, so take that and put it in the air. If you're trying to control your body in no matter what position, just, you're starting holding by your hands, but it doesn't matter what position you're in, your body's creating tone throughout the body just to maintain some level of control. Right. So your pelvic floor is doing the same thing, and you're doing things that are very ab intensive, front body intensive. So the pelvic floor just gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And aerialists don't know how to decrease that tone.
Right. Especially when you're told, especially if you're someone who's had a child, you must do the Kegel. Like that's that is going to be the magic that's going to solve the problem where, if you listen to the pelvic floor conversation, It was the Kegel. So no, Kegel. I was schooled. The Kegel rhymes with bagel. The Kegel.
Okay.
It was the Kegel muscle. It was the Kegel that caused her to have such a tight pelvic floor because she was told to do that. So I'll link that up in the show notes. But I loved how you talked about the breath, because it's like, if I can't take a deep breath, you're right, other things become more challenging.
Yeah. And so pulling it back to shoulders, which, if you're not breathing into your back upper ribs,
Yep.
it's really hard for the scapula to sit on the ribs in a way that is really stable from a hanging posture. So that can cause a lot of problems, whether you're talking about a little bit of scapular winging, or you're talking about scapula that just move a little bit when they should be the thing that is stable so that you can move your legs or you can move your hips or whatever. So years of that can cause some problems.
Yeah. And, as you talk about shoulders, like, everyone's got a cranky shoulder from doing God knows what we've done, and a lot of it, I know for me, it was a lot of pull-ups, and it was probably because I wasn't setting my scapula back.
Well, yeah, don't get me started on pull-ups. Pull-ups is one of those things. As an aerialist, I am very aware of scapular mechanics related to this, like very, very well, and how most people are taught to do a pull-up does not go with biomechanics. Yeah. We're starting a pull-up in an impinged position, so it's a real issue. But aerialists know this one because we are taught arms overhead, scapula are in the scap wrapped position, which is external rotation, protraction, right, posterior tilt, elevation,
which is all of us start here,
pulling down.
Yeah, all of us start right here. Not even paying attention. Like, you're just like, my hands are up. That's the only thing you care about. Or my hands are up and they're on the bar.
Exactly. That's
the only thing you think about. And then, as you said, like, yeah, I should think about it. My arm should be out, not in. And I totally agree with you. But also, we also, the same thing that we all do, the volume. Like, should you do as much volume as you're doing? No. Speaking from experience, no.
Yeah, I'd say pull-ups are probably a quality over quantity exercise.
Yes, absolutely. So, the things that like Rona Kim knows now versus what pre-Rona Kim did not know.
Yeah. But that's, unfortunately, sometimes that's the way we learn. And
yes. Yeah. Sometimes you got to put your hand in the fan to realize that it's going to cut you before.
Exactly. And if I wouldn't have gone through that shoulder experience, I would not be where I am now. So exactly. So, going back to what you said earlier, which I absolutely loved, is that getting stronger. So to do the aerial work, I had to change the way I was training to get stronger. And, I think so many of us started our journeys in this like bodybuilding type workouts where it was like, I'm going to deadlift, I'm going to squat, I'm going to bicep curl. Right. And it was never really a endpoint as to why I was working out. Mm-hmm. I guess there was just a hope that you were like, going to the gym, it's all good, right? Where here it was like, I had to get stronger. So what were some of the things that like tweaked a little bit between, just a traditional gym workout to a kind of getting stronger workout? Yeah, really, there was not much of an emphasis on pulling and hanging in what I was doing before. It was a much more pushing and lower body intensive type of training. And this was now, 15 years ago. Definitely styles of training have changed over time. This was before CrossFit kind of took over the world. And I remember doing a lot of like, I don't know, like lunges on boxes and box plyos and just typical movements, but not doing things super heavy because it wasn't as popular 15 years ago for women to lift as heavy.
Right.
And a lot more circuits. And it definitely, like, I had a good base level of fitness, but I didn't feel strong.
Right.
Right. And I definitely did not feel that I could hold my body weight with my hands for long periods of time.
Right, right. Yeah. So, you know, so you go to this class, you're like, this is awesome. I got to get stronger. Now, when did you start to say, you know, yourself that, okay, it's not only being strong, but I also need to have some more mobility, flexibility, stability if I'm really going to excel at being an aerialist?
Yeah, so it started with that shoulder injury, recognizing I didn't know how to breathe, which I overcorrected in the wrong direction. Suddenly I was belly breathing all the time, and that wasn't the answer either. And recognizing that part of my shoulder issue had to do with my lack of thoracic extension. Right. I was just a little kyphotic, curled in, my pecs were really tight. And again, my scapula weren't moving well on my back. So there is, this is a similar thing to that first silks class where I recognized that I wasn't strong. This chiro appointment helped me recognize that I wasn't mobile. And that was the thing that was holding me back. And I don't like to be held back, right? If I know there's a problem, I'm going to go after the solution. And because I was injured, I couldn't do my sport the way that I wanted to. So I had a lot of time suddenly that I needed to fill with something else.
Yeah.
And what I did was I was curious about gyrotonic. It's something that I'd taken a couple of classes of, but there was the person I was taking private lessons from was like an hour away, so it wasn't convenient for my schedule.
Right.
And I'd filled my schedule up with aerial. So because I couldn't do aerial, I signed up for a pre-training for gyrotonic and had no intention of becoming a trainer. I just wanted to understand the system. And I knew enough about it that I knew it was going to help me with that mobility piece that was missing. Because in the few sessions that I did, my upper back was like, oh my gosh, what is happening? So it was the first thing I thought of as far as thoracic mobility went, was gyrotonic. And that right there just completely changed my path. Yeah.
So describe gyrotonic for those people who don't know what it is.
Gyrotonic is a movement system that is all encompassing, but works on some key principles, which is, if you're familiar with somatics talk about pandiculation, which is kind of this lengthening and then releasing back. And gyrotonic uses the same principles through movements like the arch and curl. So there's a lot of lengthening, lifting, and moving into extension, and then the reverse through spinal motions. And talking also a lot about spirals through the body. And again, that wringing out sensation of spiraling with length and reaching in the body. So gyrotonic as a system uses apparatuses, machinery, like Pilates does, but there is also a mat version called gyrokinesis. So it's not necessary to have complicated machines, but they really help facilitate the movements.
Gotcha. So you go to this class and you're forever changed, that you're like, you know what? Great. You can climb, you can flip, but if you don't have this mobility, flexibility, you're always going to hit some type of ceiling in your training.
Yes. And not just, in aerial, people think about a ceiling that is related to an inability to do a, aesthetic position. It's not just that. It's an inability to align your body in ways that the joints are performing optimally and not causing wear and tear on the body. Your body obviously can create all kinds of compensations, some of which are harmful and some of which are not harmful, right?
Right.
But when you add load to some of those compensations that weren't harmful when you were just standing up, but now that you're hanging from your arms, that compensation doesn't work for your body anymore. Yes.
Yeah. And, speaking of compensations, everyone has a compensation, it's just that we don't know it. And as a trainer, I remember when I first started in this business, one of my mentors, he said, Kim, go to, and at the time I was doing a lot of road races. He's like, go to a road race. He goes and look at everyone's feet. And I still look at everyone's feet from like this for years. I look at everyone's feet. He's like, if you look at your feet, they'll tell you what's going on. Like they'll tell you where their compensation is. And it's really funny because I just look at people's feet, and I remember a friend of mine was like, well, I don't have really good balance because my big toes are longer. And I was like, that's not genetic. That's how you walk. I'm like, you walk on your tippy toes, your big toe has to be bigger so that you don't fall over. Like it just had to like compensate so that you don't fall on your face. And they were like, really? And I was like, you probably always walk that way. And so it just over time, it just had to grow. As you grew up, it just grew. And she was like, oh, like it just like blew her mind. Like she just
like bunions, right?
Yeah, she just thought that was like how she was built. And I was like, no. I mean, your toes should be the same size roughly, kind of like your fingers. Like my thumb isn't going to automatically grow longer unless I did something really weird and my thumb grew longer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a lot of debate these days about posture, right? And ideal posture. And, a lot of our compensations, like the body is trying to help us.
Yes.
Right. It's trying to help us succeed in what we're giving to it. And a lot of those compensations, if they're working, then awesome. Like there's no problem until there's a problem.
Right.
Until there is, pain associated with a compensation.
Right.
And even then, sometimes that's not even, it's sometimes really hard to know if the pain is coming from that thing or not.
Right. So, if someone's like, all right, so she, Jessica's making a good point. Like, I get it, how is, and maybe they're like, but I don't ever want to be an aerialist. Like, how would mobility training help me in my day-to-day life?
Yeah. I mean, first off, you never know what you're going to decide you want to do later in life. And that's what happened to me. I started aerial in my 30s. I'm in my 40s now. The problems came from doing aerial for a couple of years without mobility,
right,
or the ranges that I needed. I had no idea that in my 30s I was going to get into this endeavor that involved a lot of hanging from my arms.
Right. I mean, if you walk down a different street that day, who knows?
Yeah, you might decide you want to play golf. You might decide you want to play tennis. It doesn't have to be circus. It can be any activity. And suddenly the compensations in your body don't work for the sport.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And having a good general range of motion at every joint is going to benefit you for whatever you decide to do next in life. Right. Even if, you're not experiencing any discomfort now, right? What you're doing next in life may be the pandemic and sitting at a computer screen and in a posture for long periods of the day. Suddenly, guess what? You changed what you were doing.
Right.
It may have not have been a choice you wanted to make, but it's a choice that you made. And suddenly, like, your body does not respond to that new stimulus well.
Right.
And mobility is one of the things that is going to help you be able to adjust to those changes.
I like that, the ability to adjust. And, we had a lot of stuff thrown at us in the last couple of years, a lot of curveball, a lot of unforeseen experiences thrown at us. And I like that approach. And so it's kind of also like mobility is also just like a way to help prepare for the unknown.
Yes. Adaptability.
Yeah. And, one of the things I always kind of challenge my clients, and I'm going to challenge those of you listening, is that mobility can be a workout.
Oh, yes.
Because it's, I know some people here are like, well, how do I fit it into my schedule? And, what does it count as? And mobility in and of itself can actually be a workout. Mobility itself I think of like the things that have always been nagging you, they're nagging you for a reason.
Absolutely.
And so if you think back to like before you had your shoulder, actually had your shoulder injury, I'm sure there were little like inklings along the way that you're just like, you're good. And now you're like, okay, 1 + 2 = 3.
Yes. And what you said about mobility being a workout, right now, I am so sore because I took a class yesterday and I taught a class yesterday, both of which were back classes.
Yep.
And working on back extension actively, right? So lying on your stomach and pulling your chest up into a cobra position without using your hands.
Yeah.
That is a lot of strength in those spinal extensors.
Oh, yeah. And they don't, if you think about what you've been doing for the last 2 years, we're right now sitting, talking to each other. I could be hunched over typing on my computer or scanning on my phone, but this is how I've been. So for you to say now making your back like go this way, your back's like, oh, hell no.
Yes, exactly. And so when I talk about mobility, I am talking about increasing your end range and controlling your end range.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not talking about passive flexibility. And I have a hard time talking about some of these distinctions because I really don't like the terminology. Like I reject the terminology.
The terminology, first of all, it's just too complicated. Because it's like, most of the people who listen to this are just people like, I like to work out. Like that's who they're listening. And so like the difference between mobility and flexibility is there's just like a nuancy kind of thing.
It is a made up thing. It is people just made up a distinction.
Right. Because it's like flexibility just wasn't enough on its own.
Right. Well, and passive flexibility, people, no matter what it says in a textbook, passive implies passive.
Right. So if
right. So
yeah.
right, so suddenly people are using passive to mean static, not
Right.
moving, but still requiring muscular engagement, just isometrically. And for me, that's not passive. Passive is just like where you relax into something completely.
Right. Like passive is like at the end of yoga, shavasana. That's passive.
Exactly.
But if I'm got one foot up and I'm reaching towards my toe, there's some activation going on. It's not very like it's not very active, but there's still sensations happening. There's still like nerve endings firing, telling me I'm stretching my hamstring.
Well, and if I'm coaching you through that stretch, I'm asking you to lift your sits bones, move your low back into lumbar extension, going into an anterior pelvic tilt, reach through the toe, engage the quad. Like there is all of this activation happening.
Exactly. So there's activation, but even though I might not be moving anything per se, there is some type of, I say activation is movement.
Yeah. It is. Well, because again, if you are lifting your sits bones, you're going into an anterior pelvic tilt. There is a directional focus. So it's not just isometric. There's actually like isometric, but moving in a direction.
Yeah. And so, so I agree with you. So I think, if we instead of calling it mobility, if we called it active flexibility, that would make, I think, so much more like, as you're trying to like fit the pockets into your brain, that would make much more sense because, I want to be able to learn, like I said, in the pull up, we're just taught to raise your hands above your head and pull yourself up. But it's like, if you said, rotate your shoulders so that your shoulders aren't like all up in your ears before you pull yourself up, you'd be like, oh, all right. And then you said part of your practice is to like practice doing that. That is what's something I would do.
Yeah. And so when I'm thinking about mobility or active flexibility, I am always thinking about preparing the body for the ranges of motion necessary for the task at hand.
Yeah.
Right. So if your primary form of exercise is lifting, then you are mobilizing for the lifts that you do. Right. And you are mobilizing to kind of counterbalance the lifts that you do.
Right.
Because we tend to get in certain movement patterns within our exercise routines, and we need to think about balance in addition to helping us with the task.
And now, if I'm someone who, I don't have a lot of time in my life to work out, I feel like mobility work can be something that's accessible to all.
Yes.
And that it's, instead of, like we talked about going to the gym, like we just go, like there's no real end game to going to the gym. But now here it's like my end game is just my long-term healthy longevity, being able to live on my own. And I know many of us don't want to think about it, but like, let's just fast forward 40 years. You want to be able to live on your own, get out of your own damn chair, get off the toilet.
Yes.
Like you said, maybe when I'm in my 80s, I still want to be able to play golf or tennis or hell, lift a gallon of milk, something without having assistance or, sitting around dinner kibitzing about my bad, insert the joint.
Right. Or even one of the things that I've learned over the course of the pandemic is I had a change in my movement, which was to start going on walks every day, which is not something that I did before the pandemic because I just didn't have time. I was commuting all the time.
Right.
And I started walking an hour a day consistently. And suddenly I started to have SI joint pain. Because I changed what I was doing. So yes, I am doing all of this mobility work, but I am doing it with increasing ranges for my sport. I wasn't doing it to improve the quality of my gait mechanics.
Right.
Because I'm a person that hangs from my hand.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't think about feet too much. And suddenly I had to, because I changed what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I've learned now a lot about, how I need to think about the shoes that I wear, for example.
Yeah.
Because that can make a big difference in, how you walk.
Yeah, I am a shoe I'm a shoe diva, as far as, a lot of people complain to me about something. And the first thing I ask is, I say, how old are your shoes? Like, that's the first question. If you complain to me about your running or your something, I'm like, how old are your shoes? And most people are like, like they can't. And I'm like, if you don't remember when you got them, it's time for a new pair.
Yeah, well, my thing is, I was wearing really great shoes, but they were minimal shoes.
Yeah. And if you're walking a lot.
And I was walking a lot. Yeah, exactly. And I needed just a little more, like a little heel lift, and suddenly the pain went away.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there was a time, when the whole minimalist shoe movement was like, go barefoot or die kind of thing.
Right. Exactly.
And there were people going barefoot, and I was like, I live in the city. I'm like, that's just straight up like asking for some. I don't know what you're going to get, but you're asking for it.
Yeah, I was wearing socks with just like a little rubber on the bottom around the city.
Yeah, pretty much. I was like, yeah, that's just not going to happen for me. I mean, in my house, I walk barefoot, but I was like, outside, no. So if someone's, for you, the people who you train, how many days a week are you putting mobility into kind of the programs that you give them? Is it a separate mobility day?
It really depends on the goals of the client. Some people have mobility goals, and some people have other performance goals that have mobility requirements. So for someone who actually has a mobility goal, let's say they want to get a flat middle split, then they're being programmed specific longer sessions that are just devoted to mobility, going through all different types of flexibility training within that session. But for someone else, if their goal has to do with lifting their toes to a bar while hanging, a very common CrossFit type movement, then they don't need these long mobility sessions, but they do need consistent mobility work. Either before to prepare for the session, so a lot of lat opening sort of movement and scapular mobility mechanics, and then also, the hip stability control to be able to lift the toes higher toward the bar, and hamstring length. So that type of stuff might be the tail end of a weight lifting session, right? So some shoulder mobility work in the beginning that helps you prepare you for the things that you're doing, and then some hamstring, active hip mobility work at the end before you leave your session.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And just understanding sometimes the movement in the gym that you're doing is a mobility training movement. So if you're talking about a squat, guess what? A squat is mobilizing your hips and doing it under load. So that may be more thinking about your squat differently, right? Doing some sets that have a different stance or go to a different depth with different weight, just so that you're focusing on the mobility aspects and not the load aspects.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I that's a great way to think about it. And I think everyone can benefit from adding a little mobility or actually not a little, a lot of mobility to your workout.
Yeah. And it makes me think, I was talking to a client recently who was in the weight room 3 days a week doing a lower body program and doing a ton of aerial training and flexibility training as well. And I had a conversation with her, which was in this training cycle, right? Let's periodize this in this training cycle. Let's cut out those 3 days of legs.
Right.
Because guess what? The mobility work that you're doing is leg day.
Right. It's going to give you.
You're thinking about them as separate things in your brain, but they're not. So what's actually happening in your body is you're getting 5 days a week of legs, and it's too much.
Yeah. And that's why people need coaches, because like, we all get caught into that, like, sometimes we don't see the trees for the forest, and you're like, you're doing a whole lot of trees right now.
Yes. And the answer is not always more.
Yeah. I mean, it's in our culture, right? Like, if I do it one time, if I do it 400 times, clearly I'm going to nail it faster by doing that many more times. Yes.
And it is counterproductive. No matter how many times I say it to clients, it's a hard one to get to stick. That doing less actually can be more. That if you are overloading your nervous system, you are doing things that are actually counterproductive. So that extra session may be moving you backwards instead of forward.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I have a lot of, you hear that, overtrainers? I'm talking to you. Yeah. I have a lot of people who are in that, like, I must do a leg day and I must do 10 exercises. Like, every muscle group must be worked in this one day. No.
And it is also recognizing how stress impacts the body. And that if you are really, really stressed out, continuing to train a normal heavy session actually could be moving you backwards as well.
Yeah. Those are, it's one of those things, how I had to learn my lesson about my pull-ups. Like, some people, like, as much as you see your clients sprinting towards that brick wall, and much as you say, you know what, why are you doing like 10 exercises? Why don't we cut it in half? Maybe take off 2 exercises, take off a few reps. And they're like, yeah. And then you're like, that brick wall is going to come for you. I'll be there to pick you up.
Yep, exactly. But there's usually a point that they come back to you and say, yeah, you're right, I should have taken that break.
Yeah, remember that brick wall? Well, yeah, it hit me.
Yeah.
It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I'm okay not hitting that wall anymore. So what were you talking about before?
Yeah, but also the it's that whole boiling frog thing where people don't recognize the amount of stress they're under until they hit burnout. So
yeah, exactly. I don't know why. We both train a lot of women, and I don't know what it is about women that we feel like, unless like the house is literally on fire and like you're starting to see like it could implode on you, that you're like, maybe I should pay attention to some things.
Yeah, and the co-regulation aspects as well, recognizing that although you may feel pretty okay, if there are people in your household that are going through stuff, guess what? That also impacts you.
You're going through stuff too.
Yep.
So this has been like such a great conversation. We hit on so many different things. Like, one, we just talked about like just the checking your ego. For you to get into this work, you had to check your ego. You had to be like, you know what? I kind of suck at this, but I want to improve. And so it just pushed you into that thrive to, as you said, persist until. And I'm sure now you're still like, there are things on your list that you want to aspire to.
Oh, many things.
Right. But it's like, what started as like, I just want to flip myself over. And then you're like, okay, now once I flip myself over, I want to be able to do this. Now I do that now. And so it, I think everyone has this like, I arrive someplace, right? And the band's going to be playing and there's going to be glitter, maybe some shrimp. And then you're like, there's no glitter, there's no shrimp. And you either have to find that inner cheerleader to like take it to the next level, or you're disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is something that everyone struggles with. It gets to the root of why do you do what you do?
Yeah.
And when it comes to aerial, people have very different reasons for doing it. Some have to do with some of the control things that you talked about at the beginning of this.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to control your body is very empowering, especially while aging.
Yeah.
And being able to achieve new things as well. It feels great in ways that, I can't quite compare it to anything else.
Yeah. You have to find, I always say, you have to find your like lane, right? Like the lane that makes you feel most comfortable is the lane that you're going to want to keep going.
Yes. And if you're unsure of what that is, I encourage folks to think back to when they were a kid and think of the things that brought you a lot of joy, the movement things that brought you a lot of joy. Because for me, it was climbing trees.
Right.
I loved climbing trees. I loved hanging upside down on the monkey bars. I would do it all day long by myself. And yet, when I got older, I started playing tennis because that was, something that was, it was easier to, there wasn't really circus when I was young. I guess I could have been in gymnastics, but that's complicated and expensive.
And it's very different.
Yes.
It's a very different approach than aerial.
Yeah. But if you want to find the things that you love, like the little version of you didn't overthink things. They knew, he or she knew what they loved. And you probably will still gravitate toward those things.
Oh, facts. For sure. And then, we talked about breath, which I think is absolutely fabulous. And, I did a whole, I'm going to put this down too, because I'm referencing so many things. I did a whole podcast on breath work. And so, if you're like, I don't understand how this all works together, like go to that podcast. She does a great job explaining how just, it's great. It's a just great way to just get in touch with your entire body. And, what Jessica's talking about, being able to be an aerial or any type of surface thing, you have to be in your body. If your mind is over here thinking about all sorts of other things other than the being in the moment, you're going to struggle.
Yeah. And so we talked about control. The other aspect that is really wonderful about aerial is being present.
Yeah.
Right. You can't think about anything else. You can't even try to. It's just like you're trying to survive. Your body is like, I need to continue hanging on so I can survive.
Right. I need you here. Like I need you right here.
All the noise goes away.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of us, we need to find, Jessica said, find that thing that makes the noise just like, go fade back into the background. All right, this has just been a fabulous conversation. So Jessica, I asked everybody before we finish the call, I say, what makes you feel most magical?
My immediate response was something where I am moving, but then I realized that what makes me feel most magical are certain moments in coaching.
Ooh.
Yes, there is something really magical in giving a cue to someone to help them succeed in a way that feels like magic for them. So
Good.
what feels amazing are, like, I got a message today that was, Jessica gave me this magic cue. And it does feel like magic because cueing is so individual.
Yeah. It's funny because I know that feeling, because there's sometimes like you have a cue that you've been using for decades, and then you go someplace else and someone cues that very same position, movement, whatever, and they say just like one or two words, you're like, oh, yeah, like, and you're just like, it just opens up the exercise in a different way, that you're like, you know what, I think that person who, like, no matter how many times I say this damn cue doesn't get it, if I say this, will they get it?
Yes. And so cueing is very relational. And I think that that's what makes it feel magical.
Yeah, I love that. That's, no one has ever said that before, but I think that is, like, you're right. That is, when that person finally like clicks, you're like, yes.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, your own successes feel good, but that gets back to that short-lived thing. Like, you succeed, then you go to the next thing. You succeed, you go to the next thing. But when you help someone else succeed, it feels very different.
Yeah, very, very, very different. I love that. That is probably, I hear a lot of good ones, but like that one, yeah, you're absolutely right. Cause it's like, especially when you're just like, I don't know how else to describe this. And you've been like banging your head for, like, depends on how long you've been working with the person. And then when you find that those new, like, one or two phrases, you're like, holy shit, like, it was that.
Yeah, exactly.
So Jessica, I want to thank you so much for taking your time and chatting with me today. And Magic Makers, totally follow Jessica. She does some cool ass shit on Instagram. So Jessica, where can they find you?
You can find me on circusmobility.com or at Circus Mobility on Instagram and Twitter.
And yeah, so she does some cool ass shit. And for those of you guys who ever say, hey, I want to hop on the trapeze or hop on a silk, definitely look her up. She is your girl.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim.
Thanks for joining us.